Long before highways or railroads linked the world, the sea itself served as the greatest pathway of exchange. Human communities, scattered along coastlines and river mouths, looked out over vast waters and saw both a challenge and an invitation. The earliest maritime civilizations emerged where land offered abundance and the sea promised possibility. People built boats not merely as tools of survival, but as vessels of imagination, carrying them farther than their eyes could see. Wooden hulls, stitched sails, and the courage to leave the safety of the shore transformed humble villages into centers of trade, culture, and power. These beginnings were not sudden. They grew slowly, shaped by generations who learned how tides shifted, how winds could be read in the clouds, and how stars traced reliable paths across the night sky. Over time, the sea was no longer feared as an unfathomed expanse but understood as a living map, connecting distant peoples with invisible lines of water. Among the first to truly master the sea were the Minoans of Crete. Around 2000 BCE, their island rose in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean like a stepping stone between continents. Their harbors filled with sleek ships, painted with symbols of dolphins and spirals, moving with elegance across the waters. These ships carried olive oil, wine, and painted pottery to distant ports, while foreign copper and tin arrived in return, fueling both craft and trade. Frescoes from palaces such as Knossos show not only rulers and rituals, but also vibrant scenes of ships, processions, and marine life, evidence that the sea was woven into their daily imagination. To the Minoans, the horizon was not a border but an opening, and their seafaring strength allowed them to shape a maritime network that reached from Egypt to the Aegean Islands. Their tale reveals how the sea became more than geography, it became identity. Further east, the Phoenicians emerged from a narrow strip of land that is now modern-day Lebanon, ancient Phoenicia, and northern Canaan, present-day Palestine. With little arable land but abundant cedar forests, they turned necessity into innovation. Their shipbuilders crafted sturdy vessels capable of withstanding the unpredictable Mediterranean, and their merchants ventured farther than most dared. By 1200 BCE, Phoenician ships crisscrossed the seas, spreading goods, ideas, and even language. From the great cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they sailed westward, establishing colonies along the North African coast and eventually reaching as far as Spain. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense, but traders whose influence lay in exchange rather than empire. Their most enduring legacy was not only the prized purple dye extracted from murex shells coveted across ancient kingdoms, but the alphabet itself, simple, adaptable, and destined to shape written communication for centuries to come. Wherever their sails appeared, they left behind not just goods, but seeds of culture. The Nile, though often remembered for its role in farming, also carried Egypt toward maritime achievement. The river itself was a natural highway, but Egyptians also ventured into the Red Sea and Mediterranean. As early as the Old Kingdom, expeditions reached the fabled land of Punt, returning with incense, ebony, and exotic animals. Carved reliefs depict long ships, their decks crowded with oarsmen, cargo, and sails, their prows rising proudly above the waters. These journeys were not casual ventures. They were organized feats of planning and engineering, reflecting a civilization that trusted its knowledge of both river and sea. The maritime side of Egypt is sometimes overshadowed by its monuments of stone, yet the image of ships moving along the horizon reminds us that Egypt's greatness was tied not only to the desert and Nile, but also to the vast blue pathways beyond. Far to the north, the peoples of the Aegean Islands learned to trust their lives to narrow vessels carved from local timbers. These smaller communities may not have matched the scale of Egypt or the wealth of Crete, yet their skill in navigating rocky coasts and unpredictable winds made them resilient. They became intermediaries, ferrying goods and stories between larger powers, weaving themselves quietly into the fabric of Mediterranean Hitale. Archaeological remains of pottery styles shared between distant islands suggest that their maritime networks were subtle but effective. To live surrounded by sea required flexibility, and these islanders thrived by learning to read every current, every shift in the weather. Their seas were both barrier and lifeline, keeping them apart yet binding them together in an unspoken fraternity of waterborne survival. Beyond the Mediterranean, the civilizations of Mesopotamia also turned their gaze to the waters. Though known primarily for rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, Mesopotamian city-states reached the Persian Gulf with reed boats, linking them to Oman, Bahrain, and even the Indus Valley. Clay tablets record shipments of wood, copper, and precious stones arriving at their ports. These early sailors crafted vessels from bundles of reeds sealed with bitumen, remarkably buoyant and resilient against the waves. The sea was not the primary stage of Mesopotamian life, yet it offered a doorway to distant worlds. Trade with the Indus, evidenced by seals found far from their homeland, speaks of a cultural reach that extended across waters long before caravans carried goods across deserts. To sail beyond the rivers was to stretch the imagination as much as the body, redefining the limits of what was possible. In the farthest reaches of the Pacific, meanwhile, a different tale unfolded. Long before the rise of many old-world empires, Austronesian seafarers mastered the open ocean with daring unmatched elsewhere. From Taiwan, they spread outward in waves of migration, settling the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond. Their double-hulled canoes, lashed with ingenuity and guided by star charts committed to memory, carried entire communities across immense stretches of sea. To sail from island to island without compasses or maps required a deep knowledge of waves, winds, and even the flight paths of birds. These navigators turned the Pacific, the largest ocean on Earth, into a vast highway of connection. By 1000 BCE, their descendants had reached as far as Polynesia, creating one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements in maritime Hitale. Their voyages were not merely trade expeditions, but acts of settlement, weaving cultures across thousands of miles of ocean. The Sea Peoples, mysterious in both origin and legacy, appeared suddenly in the records of ancient Egypt around the 12th century BCE. They were depicted as fierce invaders arriving in fleets, armed with spears and shields, their ships cutting boldly across the waves. Their sudden presence coincided with turmoil across the eastern Mediterranean, a time when cities fell and kingdoms crumbled. Some scholars believe they were displaced groups from the Aegean or Anatolia. Others suggest they were a confederation of maritime raiders moving restlessly in search of new lands. What is clear is that they disrupted established powers, challenging Egypt itself and contributing to the collapse of older networks. Though their tale is written mostly from the perspective of those who fought them, the Sea Peoples represent the raw, unpredictable force of maritime mobility, reminding us that the sea could empower not only trade and culture, but also upheaval and destruction. As centuries passed, the Mediterranean itself became a shared stage, where cultures mingled upon the waves. Ports were not simply markets, but living crossroads where sailors exchanged not only cargo, but language, rituals, and technologies. A pot crafted in Greece might be discovered in an Egyptian storeroom. A Phoenician alphabetic inscription could appear on a shard in North Africa. The sea dissolved boundaries in ways the land never could, creating a patchwork of connections across distant shores. This constant circulation blurred lines between foreign and familiar, allowing ideas to travel faster than armies. To step into a harbour was to encounter a miniature world, filled with accents, scents, and colours carried from afar. The Mediterranean, with its scattered islands and enclosed waters, acted like a vast amphitheatre in which countless cultures performed and exchanged their stories. Maritime civilizations also reshaped warfare. Navies grew as vital instruments of power, extending influence far beyond coastlines. The trireme, a sleek warship perfected by the Greeks, symbolized how engineering and manpower could fuse into dominance at sea. With rows of oars propelling them forward and bronze-tipped rams ready to smash enemy hulls, these vessels brought strategy into the open waters. Control of the seas meant control of trade, and control of trade meant survival for city-states dependent on imported grain or metals. Battles at sea were not only clashes of ships, but contests over lifelines of entire populations. To those who lived by the coast, the sight of sails on the horizon could mean prosperity or peril, depending on whose banners they bore. The sea became both a stage of commerce and a theatre of war, where destinies were decided upon shifting waves. Religion too absorbed the rhythm of the sea. Deities of oceans, rivers, and storms held sway in many pantheons, reflecting humanity's dependence upon and fear of the waters. Poseidon in Greece, Yam in Canaan, and Sobek in Egypt were embodiments of the unpredictable, forces that could bless with abundance or destroy with sudden fury. Sailors often prayed before departure, leaving offerings to ensure safe passage. Shrines and temples along coasts testified to this deep reliance on divine favor, a spiritual insurance against the uncertainties of navigation. Even myths themselves were carried across waters, retold and reshaped in new harbors. Tales of sea monsters, heroic voyages, and lost islands spoke to the universal mixture of wonder and anxiety that the sea inspired. In this way, maritime civilizations did not only build ships and harbors, they built cosmologies shaped by the ebb and flow of tides. The sea also redefined concepts of time and distance. On land, travel was slow and bound by terrain, but the sea offered a faster, if riskier, path. A favorable wind could halve a journey that might take weeks on foot. Mariners learned to calculate not in miles, but in days of sailing, guided by the rising and setting of stars. For them, constellations were not distant ornaments, but practical maps etched into the heavens. The night sky became a clock, and waves beneath became a road. This new measure of space altered how communities perceived their place in the world. Islands that once seemed isolated could be linked within days. Continents, once unreachable, became neighbors. Time itself bent to the rhythm of the sea, and distance was no longer a fixed obstacle, but a fluid concept shaped by sails and currents. The harbours of great cities became mirrors of their civilizations. In Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, the naval harbour was designed with extraordinary precision, circular in shape, with docks radiating like spokes from a wheel. Warships could be launched swiftly from hidden slipways, while merchants unloaded cargo in bustling market squares nearby. Such harbours were not simply functional, they were statements of power, engineering, and ambition. To enter one was to feel the pulse of an entire society beating at its shore. Visitors arriving by sea would see rows of ships, hear the hammering of shipwrights, and smell spices and fish mingling in the air. The harbour was both a gateway and a stage, where first impressions of a civilization were cast not by palaces inland, but by the rhythm of maritime life. Maritime civilizations also fostered a new kind of memory, the memory of roots. Unlike farmers whose knowledge was rooted in fields, Sailors memorized coastlines, currents, and hidden reefs. This mental cartography was passed from generation to generation, creating oral maps long before ink touched parchment. A young sailor might learn that a certain island could be found by following the flight of seabirds at dusk, or that a particular current always shifted after equinox winds. These fragments of inherited wisdom became as valuable as any treasure, for without them, voyages would end in disaster. In this way, knowledge itself became a cargo one, not traded in markets but guarded within families and guilds of mariners. The sea demanded respect, and memory was the currency with which sailors paid their debts to survival. The development of lighthouses revealed how deeply civilizations sought to tame the uncertainties of water. The most famous, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, rose in the 3rd century BCE as one of the great wonders of the ancient world. Its massive tower, crowned by fire and polished bronze mirrors, projected guidance across the Mediterranean horizon. For sailors approaching Egypt's coasts, its light was a promise of safe arrival and a triumph of human ingenuity over darkness. Yet smaller beacons dotted coasts elsewhere, built of stone or even wood, each one a flicker of reassurance to weary crews. These lighthouses were more than navigational aids. They were symbols of connection, declarations that humanity would not surrender entirely to the chaos of waves. To see one shining after a long voyage was to feel embraced by civilization again. Maritime trade reshaped diets and economies, allowing foods and resources to travel far beyond their places of origin. Olives and grapes from the Mediterranean reached new tables, while grains from distant plains fed populations otherwise at risk of famine. Exotic goods such as cinnamon or ivory carried with them a sense of wonder, transforming not only palates, but imaginations. To taste something foreign was to taste the proof that the world was larger than the horizon. Ports became treasure chests where ordinary people could glimpse fragments of distant lands through spices, fabrics, or even stories told by sailors. In this way, maritime civilizations expanded more than wealth. They expanded human experience, allowing cultures to encounter flavors, textures, and ideas that reshape daily life in subtle but lasting ways. As maritime networks deepened, they also created dependencies. Cities that once thrived on local resources became reliant on distant supplies, vulnerable to disruptions at sea. A storm, a blockade, or the loss of a fleet could mean hunger or economic collapse. The prosperity brought by maritime power was matched by fragility, for the same waters that carried abundance could also deliver ruin. This delicate balance forced rulers to invest heavily in fleets, alliances, and coastal defenses. Harbors became fortified with walls and towers, while treaties were negotiated to ensure safe passage across contested waters. To be a maritime civilization was to live with both opportunity and risk woven tightly together, a reality that shaped political decisions as much as cultural growth. Shipbuilding itself became an art and a science, evolving with each generation. Early dugout canoes gave way to plank-built ships, their hulls curved and strengthened by internal frames. By studying wrecks preserved beneath sand and silt, historians today can trace the ingenuity of ancient shipwrights. Mortise and tenon joints, holding planks like puzzle pieces, ropes and pitch ceiling gaps against water. Each vessel carried not only cargo, but also the knowledge of countless hands, honed through trial and error. To walk into a shipyard in antiquity was to enter a place alive with sound, the rasp of saws, the creak of bending timbers, the thud of mallets securing nails. Shipbuilding was more than a craft. It was the beating heart of maritime civilization, the foundation upon which exploration, trade, and conquest all depended. Navigation, too, advanced beyond instinct into structured systems. The Phoenicians were reputed to have steered by the North Star, a reliable guide that held steady in the heavens while others shifted through the night. Greek scholars later documented winds and currents, compiling knowledge into manuals for future sailors. Such records reflect not only practical needs, but also a growing intellectual curiosity, the desire to understand the sea as more than a hazard. Mariners who once trusted only inherited memory began to test, measure, and compare their observations, laying the groundwork for science itself. Every successful voyage confirmed that knowledge could wrest order from uncertainty. Each failure reminded them that the sea, though studied, remained ultimately untamed. In this constant dialogue between human effort and natural force, maritime civilizations forged resilience and humility alike. The influence of maritime civilizations extended inland as well. Goods arriving at ports traveled upriver or along caravan routes, penetrating deep into continents. A piece of glass from the Mediterranean might appear in a Germanic settlement. A spice from India could find its way into an Egyptian temple offering. These inland communities, though far from coasts, became linked to maritime networks indirectly, their lives altered by forces they could scarcely imagine. For farmers and villagers, the sea was a distant mystery, yet its power reached them through objects, tastes, and technologies. In this sense, maritime civilizations were not isolated phenomena, but engines that propelled global connection. The ocean was the artery, but its pulse was felt even in the quietest corners of the ancient world. For all their achievements, maritime civilizations were also vulnerable to the sea's unpredictability. Storms could scatter fleets, pirates could ambush merchant convoys, and shifting sands could swallow entire harbors. Archaeological evidence shows shipwrecks filled with amphorae still resting on seabeds, silent witnesses to voyages cut short. Each wreck was both tragedy and lesson, reminding sailors of the fine line between fortune and failure. Communities learned to rebuild after loss, often honoring those who never returned through rituals or memorials. These dangers gave the sea a dual identity. It was both a giver of life and a taker of it, demanding constant respect. Maritime peoples lived with this tension daily, shaping cultures that were both adventurous and cautious, daring yet reverent before the waters they depended on. Legends of lost lands and sunken cities grew naturally from this precarious relationship. Tales of Atlantis, for example, first recorded by Plato, reflected both admiration for maritime power and anxiety over its fragility. Such myths spoke of civilizations that rose high through mastery of the seas but fell just as swiftly, claimed by waves. Whether real or allegorical, these stories echoed across cultures, blending memory and imagination. They reminded listeners that no matter how advanced a people might become, the sea remained beyond total control. Sailors returning from storms often carried not only scars, but also stories, embellished or true of horizons glimpsed and dangers narrowly escaped. These legends became part of the shared maritime heritage, passed along like maps of caution etched into cultural memory. By the time antiquity gave way to new empires and expanding horizons, maritime civilizations had already redrawn the human relationship with the world. They proved that oceans were not barriers but bridges, that cultures could flourish not by turning inward, but by reaching outward. Their ships carried more than goods. They carried ideas, technologies, and dreams, knitting distant peoples into an early form of global community. The sea remained dangerous, yes, but it also held possibility too vast to ignore. To live by the water was to live with a wider horizon. And those who embraced it left behind legacies that still ripple through our modern world. Chapter 1 closes with this truth. The sea shaped not only civilizations of the past, but the very course of human destiny. With the close of the Bronze Age, the seas became more than trade routes. They grew into theatres where empires tested their strength. The rise of the Greek city-states signaled a new chapter in maritime Italy, one defined not only by commerce but also by competition. Athens, perched on the edge of the Aegean, looked outward and built a fleet that would carry it to dominance. Its wooden triremes, sleek and fast, symbolized a shift from local networks to organized naval supremacy. This transformation turned the Aegean from a patchwork of isolated islands into a contested arena where strategy, politics, and identity all intertwined. The sea was no longer just a lifeline of connection. It became the foundation of political power. Athens' naval might found its most famous test in the Persian Wars. When Persian fleets threatened to overwhelm the Greek mainland, it was the triremes of the Athenians and their allies that held the line. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE stands as one of the defining moments in maritime Italy. Narrow straits and clever maneuvers allowed the smaller Greek fleet to outmatch the Persians, proving that mastery of the sea could overturn overwhelming odds. Victory secured not only Greek independence, but also the idea that naval strategy could decide the fate of nations. From that moment, Athens poured its wealth into maintaining its fleet, ensuring that the oars of thousands of citizens propelled both its democracy and its empire. The Athenians did not merely defend their coasts, they built what became known as the Delian League, a maritime alliance that stretched across the Aegean. Member states contributed ships or tribute, and in return, Athens promised protection from outside threats. Yet over time, this alliance shifted into an empire, with Athens tightening its control over its partners. Tribute funded grand temples and theatres in the city, but it was the navy that enforced compliance. Maritime supremacy allowed Athens to dictate terms far beyond its shores, shaping the political landscape of the Greek world. For its citizens, the sea was both shield and sword, the element through which their democracy projected its might. Yet Athens was not alone in its maritime ambitions. Sparta, though less dependent on ships, recognized that dominance of the sea meant dominance of Greece itself. During the Peloponnesian War, naval battles became decisive, with fleets clashing across the Aegean in long campaigns of attrition. The war revealed the vulnerabilities of relying too heavily on maritime power. When fleets were destroyed, supplies vanished, and cities starved. For nearly 3 decades, Greece tore itself apart upon the waters, until Sparta, aided by Persian funding, finally broke Athenian supremacy. The fall of Athens' empire marked a sobering reminder that the sea, though empowering, could not guarantee eternal rule. Maritime power was a gift that demanded constant defense and renewal. Elsewhere across the Western Mediterranean, another maritime giant was rising: Carthage. Descended from Phoenician settlers, Carthage grew from a colony into a formidable naval power. Its harbors, meticulously engineered, could house hundreds of warships and merchant vessels. Carthaginian sailors were famed for their skill in navigation and for venturing into the Atlantic, reaching as far as the Canary Islands. The wealth of Carthage rested on trade, but its survival depended on its fleet. To the Romans, who looked with envy across the Tyrrhenian Sea, Carthage became both rival and obstacle. Two worlds were now set on a collision course, and the Mediterranean would soon bear witness to wars of unprecedented scale. The Punic Wars, fought between Rome and Carthage, reshaped the Mediterranean forever. Carthage entered with centuries of naval experience, while Rome was still learning the craft of the sea. Yet necessity spurred innovation. The Romans developed the corvus, a boarding device that transformed naval battles into infantry engagements, playing to their strength on land. Through persistence, resources, and sheer determination, Rome gradually gained the upper hand. By the end of the Third Punic War, Carthage lay in ruins, its harbors destroyed, and its people scattered. The Mediterranean, once a shared space of many powers, had become Mare Nostrum, our sea, claimed by Rome as the lifeblood of its empire. Maritime civilization had entered an imperial age, and with it came both stability and domination. Rome's mastery of the sea reshaped daily life across the empire. Grain from Egypt fed the bustling streets of Rome, timber from the Balkans built its fleets, and spices from the east flavored its feasts. Merchant ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean in carefully scheduled convoys, guarded by warships that kept piracy at bay. To the Romans, the sea became an extension of their road system, a blue highway binding together provinces from Britain to Syria. Amphorae stamped with the marks of Roman potters have been found in shipwrecks as far as Spain and Tunisia, silent witnesses to the vast scale of commerce. Maritime infrastructure such as lighthouses, warehouses and breakwaters was expanded on a scale that rivaled Rome's roads and aqueducts. The empire did not merely sit beside the sea, it lived through it. The Pax Romana, Rome's peace, allowed Mediterranean waters to flow with a steadiness rarely seen before. Pirates who once terrorized coastlines were hunted down, their havens destroyed, until maritime trade could move with relative security. The result was a flourishing of cultural exchange. Ideas, religions, and art moved along the same routes as olive oil and glass. Christianity itself spread first along the coasts and ports of the empire, carried by sailors and merchants who crossed the waters. In this way, Rome's maritime power was not only economic and military, but also cultural, shaping the spiritual identity of the Western world. The sea that had once been fragmented by competing powers became, for a time, a unified basin of shared experience. Still, Rome's reliance on the sea made it vulnerable to disruption. When grain shipments faltered, riots erupted in the capital. Naval blockades during civil wars revealed how fragile the lifeline truly was. The empire's enemies also learned to exploit these weaknesses, raiding coastal settlements or targeting supply fleets. In the later centuries, as Rome struggled with internal division and external pressure, control of the Mediterranean weakened. Pirates re-emerged, trade slowed, and coastal populations suffered. The very sea that had secured Rome's dominance now mirrored its decline, reflecting both its glory and its fragility. Maritime power, once the symbol of Rome's invincibility, had become a measure of its fading grasp. Beyond Rome, other cultures continued to shape maritime traditions. In the Indian Ocean, powerful kingdoms such as the Cholas of southern India built fleets that extended influence across Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Their ships carried not only goods, but also architecture, religion, and language, spreading Indian culture far beyond the subcontinent. Arab sailors, meanwhile, perfected the lateen sail, a triangular rig that allowed ships to tack against the wind with remarkable efficiency. This innovation would spread westward, and centuries later, revolutionize European exploration. In these regions, monsoon winds dictated the rhythm of life, their predictable cycles guiding trade from East Africa to the Malay archipelago. The sea here was less a barrier than a seasonal heartbeat, connecting civilizations through patterns of wind and tide. The Silk Road is often remembered as a land route, yet its maritime counterpart carried equal weight. Known as the Maritime Silk Road, it linked China with India, Arabia, and eventually the Roman Empire. Chinese silk, porcelain, and lacquerware traveled westward, while horses, glass, and precious stones made their way east. Ports like Guangzhou became bustling hubs where cultures intersected, alive with the chatter of multiple tongues. The spread of Buddhism from India to China owes much to these sea routes, carried not only by monks, but by the sailors who ferried them across waters. This network reveals how maritime civilizations were never isolated. They were part of a greater global tapestry woven with both sails and caravans. In northern Europe, the rise of seafaring cultures was beginning to reshape distant shores. Germanic tribes along the North Sea honed skills in boat building, crafting vessels that could withstand colder, harsher waters. These early traditions would eventually give rise to the seafaring prowess of the Vikings. But even in their formative stages, the sea played a central role. Communities relied on fishing, coastal raiding, and limited trade, learning to trust their survival to narrow wooden craft. Though less celebrated in Roman records, these northern sailors were laying foundations for a maritime tradition that would erupt centuries later with full force. The seeds of a northern maritime civilization had been sown, waiting for the right moment to surge outward. While Rome waned, Byzantium rose as its eastern successor, inheriting both maritime wealth and strategic location. Constantinople, perched between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, became a city whose life pulsed with the tides. Its harbors brimmed with ships carrying grain, silk, and spices, while its massive seawalls stood as barriers against naval assault. The Byzantine navy developed the fearsome weapon known as Greek fire, a substance that could burn even upon water, striking terror into enemies. Through mastery of sea lanes and inventive defense, Byzantium endured for centuries, a beacon of continuity between antiquity and the medieval world. Its survival depended not only on fortresses and faith, but on the unbroken rhythm of oars and sails upon the waves. In the Western Mediterranean, a new maritime power emerged from unexpected shores, the Vandals. After crossing into North Africa in the 5th century CE, they built a fleet that terrorized Roman remnants and plundered coasts. Their raids on Italy, including the infamous sack of Rome in 455, underscored the vulnerability of empires when sea power slipped from their grasp. Though their dominance was short-lived, the Vandals remind us how swiftly maritime strength could elevate a people from obscurity to notoriety. In a world where control of waters meant control of resources, even newcomers could rise to prominence if they mastered the sea. Further north, the Norse world began to stir. By the 8th century, Viking longships became the marvel and menace of Europe. Crafted with clinker-built hulls, shallow drafts, and flexible design, these vessels could slice across open seas, yet slip into rivers with equal ease. With them, Vikings raided monasteries on the coasts of Britain, traded furs and amber deep into Russia, and even reached as far as Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland in North America. The longship was more than conveyance. It was a symbol of freedom and ferocity, enabling a people from scattered fjords to etch their names across continents. Their mastery of the northern seas expanded the concept of maritime civilization beyond the warm Mediterranean into harsher, colder waters. The Viking voyages were not purely violent. They also built settlements, fostered trade, and carried cultural influence far and wide. Towns like Hedeby and Birka thrived as trading hubs, where goods from the Islamic world mingled with wares from the Baltic. The Norse navigated not by compass, but by sunstones, wave patterns, and an uncanny memory of coasts. Their sagas recall journeys that blurred lines between myth and reality. Yet archaeological finds coins from Baghdad, silk from China prove their reach was vast. The Vikings remind us that maritime civilizations were not defined solely by conquest, but by mobility, adaptability, and the ability to bridge distant worlds. As the Norse expanded west, the Islamic caliphates extended maritime influence east and south. From the 7th century onward, Arab fleets dominated the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, projecting both military and commercial power. Cities like Basra and Aden flourished as ports, linking caravan routes with sea trade that spanned from East Africa to India. Arab geographers meticulously recorded winds, stars, and currents, refining navigation into an advanced science. Their dhows, with elegant lateen sails, became iconic symbols of the Indian Ocean. Through them, not only goods, but also mathematics, astronomy, and literature spread across continents. The Islamic maritime world was not merely commercial, it was intellectual, a current carrying knowledge between civilizations. East Africa joined this network through the rise of the Swahili coast. From the 9th century, cities such as Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar became vibrant maritime centers. Their stone houses and mosques overlooked harbors filled with dhows from Arabia, India, and later even China. Gold, ivory, and slaves moved outward, while ceramics, textiles, and spices flowed inward. The Swahili culture itself became a fusion of African and Arab influences, shaped directly by the sea. Here, maritime civilization was not confined to one people, but born from centuries of exchange. The rhythmic monsoon winds stitched East Africa into the grand tapestry of the Indian Ocean world, proving again that oceans are highways of identity. To the east, China's maritime tale deepened under the Tang and Song dynasties. Advances in shipbuilding produced massive junks with watertight bulkheads and sternpost rudders, innovations far ahead of their time. These ships carried porcelain, silk, and tea to markets as far as the Middle East, returning with horses, spices, and precious stones. Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses, revolutionizing navigation by freeing mariners from sole reliance on stars and winds. Ports like Quanzhou bustled with merchants from across Asia, creating cosmopolitan cities where languages blended and traditions mingled. The sea became both frontier and foundation of Chinese global influence, a stage where empire met horizon. The Mongol Empire, though famous for its horsemen, also left its mark on maritime Hitale. Kublai Khan launched ambitious naval expeditions, most famously against Japan in the 13th century. These attempts ended in disaster, thwarted by storms the Japanese called kamikaze, or divine winds. Yet the scale of these fleets, hundreds of ships, carrying tens of thousands of men, revealed how seriously even land empires took the sea. In Southeast Asia, Mongol fleets battled kingdoms in Vietnam and Java, underscoring that maritime dominance was inseparable from imperial ambition. Though not remembered as a maritime civilization, the Mongols showed that even steppe conquerors could not ignore the power of the waves. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Polynesian voyagers continued their astonishing mastery of open ocean navigation. Long after their initial migrations, they maintained networks linking Hawaii, Tahiti, and New Zealand. Oral traditions preserved routes, and rituals honored ancestors who first dared to cross unbroken horizons. For centuries, Western observers doubted their capacity, imagining their settlements accidental. Yet modern studies of star charts, canoe reconstructions, and oral wisdom confirm their deliberate skill. These sailors read swells, bird flights, and even subtle shifts in the color of water to guide their journeys. Their achievements stand as some of humanity's greatest maritime feats, rivaling any empire's fleets in daring and scope. By the close of the medieval era, the world's seas had become interlinked corridors of exchange. From the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, from the North Sea to the Pacific, maritime civilizations had shaped trade, warfare, religion, and culture. No longer were oceans vast unknowns. They were familiar routes etched with centuries of memory. Yet new horizons still beckoned. rumors of distant lands, whispers of wealth across uncharted waters, and the slow accumulation of navigational knowledge set the stage for a coming transformation. The seas that had already bound civilizations together would soon propel humanity into a new age of discovery, an age that would expand maritime civilization from regional networks to truly global dimensions. As the medieval world drew to its close, the momentum of centuries of seafaring pressed humanity toward uncharted waters. The accumulated wisdom of Phoenician traders, Greek navigators, Arab geographers, Chinese shipwrights, and Polynesian voyagers formed a foundation upon which new ambitions could rise. The sea had been teacher and adversary, gift and grave, yet always it remained the path to possibility. By the late 15th century, curiosity and necessity converged, and the age of great voyages was ready to dawn. Europe, standing on the edge of the Atlantic, prepared to push outward, guided by borrowed knowledge and driven by dreams of wealth, faith, and discovery. Chapter 2 closes at this threshold, a moment when maritime civilizations were no longer regional powers, but the architects of a world that would soon be bound together by sails stretched against the wind. The 15th century opened with whispers of change across Europe's coasts. For centuries, Europeans had traded within the familiar bounds of the Mediterranean, relying on overland caravans and middlemen to reach the spices, silks, and treasures of the East. Yet new forces stirred. Stronger monarchies eager to expand their reach, merchants hungry for profit, and shipbuilders refining vessels capable of longer journeys. The sea, once a regional stage, now beckoned as a global frontier. To venture beyond familiar waters required more than courage. It demanded an accumulation of navigational tools, political will, and the restless ambition of societies that had always looked outward for opportunity. Portugal became the first European kingdom to commit itself fully to oceanic exploration. Guided by Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors pushed southward along the Atlantic coast of Africa. Each voyage extended the map, revealing new currents, unfamiliar winds, and distant shores. By the mid-15th century, they had reached the Cape Verde Islands, establishing way stations that would anchor future expeditions. These early ventures were not only quests for knowledge, but also for resources: gold, ivory, and slaves. The blending of scientific curiosity with economic desire shaped Europe's maritime expansion from its very beginning, setting a pattern that would carry forward for centuries. Ship design played a crucial role in this age of exploration. The development of the caravel, with its lateen sails and nimble hull, allowed sailors to tack against the wind and venture farther than ever before. Unlike the heavy galleys of the Mediterranean, caravels were versatile, capable of both coastal reconnaissance and open ocean voyages. These ships became the workhorses of Portuguese expeditions, carrying explorers such as Bartolomeu Dias, who in 1488 rounded the storm-lashed Cape of Good Hope. His success proved that the route to the riches of India lay not overland through hostile empires, but upon the endless sweep of the sea. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, soon entered the maritime contest. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed westward, convinced he would reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. Instead, he encountered lands unknown to Europeans, lands already home to thriving civilizations. The voyage did not achieve its intended goal, yet it altered human Italy irrevocably. What began as a search for spices became the beginning of transatlantic exchange, linking continents that had long developed in isolation. Crops, animals, and diseases crossed oceans, reshaping diets, economies, and populations on a global scale. The sea had become the bridge between worlds, and maritime civilization had entered a new, truly planetary dimension. In the wake of Columbus, other explorers pressed outward. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 secured Portugal's place in the Indian Ocean, where they built fortified outposts from Goa to Malacca. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, though he himself perished en route, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe, proving that the oceans were not disconnected bodies of water, but a single, vast expanse. These journeys revealed the scale of the planet in ways no earlier civilization had fully comprehended. For the first time, humanity could conceive of the world as a whole, stitched together by the sails of daring fleets. Maritime empires began to rise in the wake of these discoveries. Spain and Portugal divided the non-European world between them through the Treaty of Tordesillas, an agreement blessed by the Pope, yet contested by other powers. Silver from the mines of the Americas poured into Spanish galleons, enriching the crown while fueling inflation across Europe. Portuguese spice routes fed the growing appetites of European markets, turning distant seas into arteries of wealth. These maritime empires were not built only on exploration, but on sustained systems of control. Forts guarding harbours, fleets patrolling sea lanes, and colonies anchoring distant shores. The ocean had become both empire and battlefield. Other European states soon challenged Iberian dominance. The Dutch, with their formidable merchant fleet, established the Dutch East India Company in 1602, pioneering corporate colonization and dominating spice trade routes in Southeast Asia. Their ships, efficient and fast, outpaced rivals and carried goods on a scale never before imagined. The English too entered the contest, founding the East India Company in 1600 and planting colonies in North America. France followed, its explorers and traders reaching Canada, the Caribbean, and beyond. The competition for maritime supremacy reshaped global politics, fueling wars not only on land but across oceans, where sea battles determined the fate of continents. The human cost of this expansion was immense. Enslaved Africans were torn from their homelands and conveyanced across the Atlantic in horrific conditions, their labor sustaining plantations that enriched European powers. Indigenous peoples in the Americas faced disease, displacement, and violence on an unprecedented scale. The sea that carried explorers and merchants also carried chains and sorrow, binding millions into a system of suffering that would shape the modern world. Maritime civilization in this era was thus a paradox. It opened the globe to exchange and discovery, but it also deepened inequality, exploitation, and conquest. The ocean mirrored humanity itself, capable of generosity and cruelty in equal measure. As European powers expanded across the seas, knowledge of navigation advanced rapidly. Improved maps, or portolan charts, depicted coastlines with remarkable accuracy, guiding mariners through dangerous shoals and narrow straits. The magnetic compass became a standard tool, while advances in astronomy allowed sailors to measure latitude more precisely using sextants and astrolabes. Each innovation reduced, though never eliminated, the risks of ocean travel. The seas remained perilous, but the growing science of navigation transformed exploration from gamble into calculated venture. In this marriage of tradition and innovation, maritime civilization entered a new intellectual age, one where observation and record-keeping carried equal weight to courage and faith. Naval warfare too was revolutionized. Wooden triremes and oared galleys gave way to towering ships of the line, bristling with cannons that could unleash thunder across the waves. Control of the seas was no longer won by ramming or boarding, but by firepower, maneuver, and discipline. Nations invested heavily in navies, aware that a single decisive battle could alter the balance of global power. The English defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked such a turning point, proving that mastery of ships and weather could overcome even a seemingly invincible foe. From then on, empires would be decided as much by naval supremacy as by armies marching on land. The 17th and 18th centuries became the age of maritime commerce on an unprecedented scale. Merchant convoys, often escorted by naval squadrons, carried tobacco, sugar, tea, and textiles across vast distances. London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon thrived as global hubs where goods from every corner of the world converged. Coffee houses buzzed with merchants, sailors, and investors, their conversations reflecting a world increasingly tied together by the sea. Insurance companies, stock exchanges, and global finance all grew from this maritime foundation, as risk and reward of oceanic trade demanded new systems of trust and calculation. Maritime civilization was no longer just cultural or military, it had become economic at its very core. In Asia, older maritime traditions encountered and adapted to this European intrusion. The Ming dynasty of China had earlier launched the grand voyages of Admiral Zheng He, whose massive treasure fleet sailed across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century. These ships, some among the largest wooden vessels ever built, carried silks, porcelains, and envoys of imperial power to distant ports from East Africa to Arabia. Yet after Zheng He's death, China turned inward, retreating from oceanic ambition just as Europe surged forward. This contrast highlights how choices in maritime engagement could alter the trajectory of civilizations, determining whether they expanded outward or folded into themselves. Japan too grappled with the sea's possibilities and perils. During the Tokugawa shogunate, foreign trade was tightly controlled, with only limited contact allowed through the port of Nagasaki, where Dutch and Chinese merchants were permitted to trade under strict supervision. This policy of seclusion preserved internal stability but limited Japan's role in the maritime world. Yet the Japanese never lost their seafaring traditions, and when the nation reopened in the 19th century, it rapidly embraced maritime technology, rising swiftly into the ranks of global naval powers. The ebb and flow of Japan's maritime engagement reveals how the ocean could be alternately embraced and resisted, yet never ignored. In Africa, the impact of maritime civilization was deeply ambivalent. Coastal kingdoms such as Benin, Dahomey, and Congo engaged directly with European traders, sometimes prospering through the exchange of gold, ivory, and slaves. Yet the Atlantic slave trade devastated inland communities, fracturing societies and depopulating entire regions. The shoreline became both opportunity and danger, a place where wealth could be amassed, but at a cost measured in human lives. Maritime power reshaped Africa, not through colonization at first, but through exploitation, laying the groundwork for future imperial domination. The sea, once a neutral frontier, had become an instrument of asymmetrical power. The Americas, meanwhile, were utterly transformed by maritime exchange. Crops such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes crossed the Atlantic, revolutionizing diets in Europe, Africa, and Asia. In return, horses, cattle, and wheat reshaped life in the New World. This Columbian exchange altered ecosystems as well as societies, linking continents in a web of mutual dependence. Yet the exchange was not equal. European diseases decimated indigenous populations, while colonial systems imposed foreign rule and extraction. The The ships that crossed the Atlantic carried not only goods but destinies, weaving together worlds that had once developed apart into a single fragile network. As centuries passed, maritime technology continued to evolve. The age of sail reached its zenith in the 18th century, with frigates and clippers capable of remarkable speed and endurance. These vessels connected colonies to empires with increasing efficiency, carrying letters, newspapers, and ideas as well as cargo. For ordinary people, the rhythm of the sea became the rhythm of daily life. Tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, and cotton from India entered European homes, making distant oceans tangible through simple rituals. Even those who never saw the sea were touched by its influence, their lives shaped by currents and winds they would never witness firsthand. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on observation and reason, found fertile ground upon the ocean. Scientific expeditions accompanied trade and conquest, mapping coastlines, cataloguing species, and measuring the mysteries of tides and currents. Voyages such as those of Captain James Cook blended exploration with scholarship, producing charts that remained authoritative for generations. The sea became a laboratory as much as a highway, a place where naturalists, astronomers, and cartographers collaborated with sailors to expand humanity's understanding of the planet. Maritime civilization had become not only practical and political, but also profoundly scientific, driving forward the very framework of modern knowledge. By the dawn of the 19th century, the foundations of the modern world had been laid upon the waters. Empires spanned oceans, fueled by colonies and commerce. Naval power determined international rivalries, while maritime trade sustained industrial growth. The great age of exploration had given way to the age of empire, where the seas were no longer places of mystery, but of contest and control. Yet the ocean retained its dual nature, a pathway of opportunity and a field of struggle, as steam engines began to appear on ships, promising to free sailors from the tyranny of wind. A new chapter was about to begin, one where maritime civilization would shape not only trade and conquest, but the very pace of human progress. The Industrial Revolution transformed the sea as profoundly as it did the land. Steamships, no longer dependent on sails and winds, cut across oceans with unprecedented reliability. Iron and steel replaced timber, producing vessels stronger and larger than anything before. Maritime trade accelerated, shrinking the world in ways that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Ports became industrial hubs, filled with cranes, warehouses, and railways feeding into harbors. For the first time in Italy, global commerce moved to a rhythm determined not by tides and tempests, but by timetables and engines. The sea had become mechanized, and maritime civilization entered a modern age. This transformation also reshaped naval warfare. Steam-driven warships with armored hulls and explosive shells rendered wooden fleets obsolete. The great naval arms races of the 19th and early 20th centuries, from Britain's dreadnoughts to Germany's expanding fleet, underscored how maritime supremacy was now tied to industrial capacity. Battles such as Tsushima in 1905 proved the decisive power of modern navies, while the First and Second World Wars confirmed that control of sea lanes was essential to victory. Submarines, aircraft carriers, and amphibious landings extended the theatre of war across every ocean, cementing the sea's role as the ultimate stage of global conflict. Yet even amid war and empire, the sea remained a source of cultural exchange and human imagination. Steamships carried immigrants across the Atlantic, filling new worlds with voices from old ones. Oceans became pathways of hope for millions seeking better lives, as well as bridges of cultural blending that reshaped nations. Ports like New York, Buenos Aires, and Sydney grew into cosmopolitan centers where the legacies of maritime civilization mingled in faces, languages, and traditions. The sea was no longer just the realm of merchants or conquerors. It had become a shared experience for entire societies, carrying not only goods and armies, but dreams of transformation. In the modern era, maritime civilization continues to shape humanity in ways both familiar and new. Global trade remains overwhelmingly oceanic, with massive container ships carrying the bulk of the world's goods. Undersea cables transmit digital information, turning oceans into invisible highways of communication, as well as conveyance. Fisheries sustain billions, though they also face collapse from overuse. Climate change threatens rising seas that endanger coastal cities, reminding us once again that the sea is both ally and adversary. The tale of maritime civilization is not one of the past alone. It is an unfolding narrative that still defines the present. Looking back across millennia, the sea emerges not merely as a backdrop to human Hitala, but as one of its central characters. From Minoan traders to Polynesian navigators, from Roman fleets to industrial steamships, the ocean has shaped how civilizations rose, connected, and transformed. It has been feared and revered, exploited and protected, yet always it remained the great pathway of possibility. As humanity stands at the edge of new frontiers, space exploration, digital networks, ecological survival, the lessons of the sea remain timeless. That connection brings both risk and opportunity, that horizons invite daring, and that civilizations thrive when they learn to sail outward. Thus closes the third chapter. The tale of maritime civilization is, at its heart, the tale of humanity itself, forever bound to the tides.